People throw the phrase dead game around all the time, even when it's actively updating. But what about series that are truly dead and won't ever return? This could be due to a number of factors, but the number one reason is always that the most recent entry didn't meet the company's sales expectations. Sometimes they can be more nuanced, like not having a team to actually make the game, or the company can wait if they don't want to make a new entry too soon, or the IP is lost in limbo. Let's discuss some of the series that haven't had a new entry in quite some time and examine the possibility of a potential return to see how truly dead a series really is. Some are on life support, where it's just collections of their older titles, which is great, but when is a new entry coming? This isn't an exhaustive list of every dead fighter ever, but some notable ones that haven't been in the limelight for some time. My judgment on a series returning is based on a lot of research, but also my own personal opinion. Battle Arena Toshinden had a slow death. It launched with the PS1 and was meant as a graphical showcase for the system as its premier fighting game, though the Tekken series stole much of its thunder. Toshinden had been best known for the releases on the PS1, but they had entries on the Game Boy, Saturn, arcade, and PC. There were also non-fighting game spin-offs that were Japan only, which showed that the series had momentum behind it. But Tekken and Soul Calibur made it look ancient in comparison. The franchise spreading themselves out didn't seem to help, since it went on a long break after the fourth game in 1999, only to return for a reboot on the Wii a decade later in 2009. This release had none of the same cast as the previous titles, and the gameplay was more of an arena fighter. Being released only in Japan didn't help anything either. It even underperformed in Japan, which was probably the second nail in the coffin. The companies that own the IP are still in business, but making a new 3D fighter with a small budget was probably not in the cards. Even releasing a collection doesn't seem wise since no one's really demanding it, and to a casual crowd, these games have not aged well. Namco can't even be convinced to do a Tekken collection. What makes you think Takara would do a Battle Arena Toshinden one first? The last Battle Arena thing to ever release was the first game being ported to the critically panned PS1 classic. Even on that mini console, Tekken 3 was there to overshadow it again. From the evidence here, this series is deader than dead. I don't think a re-release on PlayStation Plus is in the cards anymore. Unlike other series we'll be talking about, I don't really hear about anyone demanding to bring this back. A pity to not have the older games accessible, but them's the breaks. Going over to a series that helped bury Toshinden, Soul Calibur. Harada, who's produced and supervised Namco games beyond just Tekken, spoke to Twitter on a random lunch break discussing Soul Calibur and why there hasn't been a new entry since last generation's Soul Calibur 6. It mostly boils down to key members of Team Soul leaving Namco. Harada states the team isn't what it used to be, but he is hopeful that a new entry will be greenlit one day. The series wasn't exactly doing badly before either. Sure, Soul Calibur 5 didn't do as well as Namco I'm sure hoped, but the 6th game did make a profit from what I found. Having certain guest characters helped the series immensely in the past, and it's often how casuals identify each game. Soul Calibur 4 is the best-selling entry because, go figure, having two of the most popular characters in all fiction will help sales a bit. You can tell with Soul Calibur 6 that it was their last chance to get back on top. Tekken 7 was in the exact same position, but with greater success. Soul Calibur 6 had to go with more of a budget approach by not having as large of a roster, foregoing CG cutscenes, and even downgrading the stages to more generic fare, but Tekken 7 did the exact same thing, so it's something that can work. Tekken 7, I think, sold way beyond Namco's expectations, and Soul Calibur was deemed successful by Namco themselves, but the team lead Okubo left Namco shortly after the final DLC for Season 2 release, which backs Harada's point that the team doesn't have a leader or vision to make another one without him. It'd be foolish to think this series is dead. Even though it was a success, it wasn't enough of one where Namco greenlit a sequel as fast as Tekken. I do think it's fairly likely we'll get a new entry, perhaps late into this console's generation's life cycle, or perhaps even the next one. Killer Instinct is in a similar position to Soul Calibur in terms of probability for a return. For a while, there was a rumor that one was being made in Japan by Namco, which is wild if that were true, but it seems like no one's making it. It certainly did appear like it did well for Microsoft, but since Bethesda and Activision were bought out by them, the need to greenlight a new KI has fallen by the wayside. I think Microsoft is using the companies they bought as a crutch for their Xbox exclusives, and their other studios seem relegated to work on Forza, Halo, and Gears. The folks at Iron Galaxy have moved on to other things, but they are still willing to work on KI based on them updating the game many years after the final DLC released. Perhaps these latest balance updates were Microsoft testing the waters on if there were still interest in the IP by putting in as little money as possible, since doing this would certainly get attention from the FGC and video games news sites, basically free advertising. This early on, it's hard to say if this was successful or not, but like with Soul Calibur, I don't think the series is going to remain dormant. If anything, if the update was proven a success, then I think it would help make that return happen much sooner. If not, probably would push this return further down the road, since again, the game itself did well, a balance update succeeding or not won't change that. I think the return for KI is pretty likely. The Bloody Roar series was on death row until Konami themselves shotgun blasted it in the face. The series, starting on the PS1, was able to compete with the likes of Tekken and Soul Calibur due to its speed and being able to change into an animal seamlessly in battle. That helped them stick out quite a bit from the competition, though during the PS2 generation, it was difficult for them to differentiate themselves with the same shtick. Despite it being enjoyable, it was hard for the likes of Bloody Roar 3 to compete with Tekken Tag and DOA 2. If someone sees these games side by side, Bloody Roar is gonna look pretty budget in comparison. Even with that, the third game sold well enough to warrant 2 more games. But with Bloody Roar 4, which is the 5th game in the series, I think things came to a halt. Fans didn't seem taken with this game as much, and looks like the sales reflected that. Bloody Roar 5 was announced on Twitter back in 2011, but hate to rub salt in the wound, that was a proven hoax. Konami gobbled up Hudson Soft's IPs, and now Bloody Roar is locked up with them. All that doom and gloom aside, I think the chance of a collection is in the cards for Konami, my only reason being how collection happy they've been recently, although since they cleaned house of most of their gaming divisions in favor of pachinko, they've had to resort to other studios to develop their games. However, it's very rare that a PS1 game is ever included in modern collections. It seems companies have a stigma with that particular generation, since I very rarely see re-releases of PS1 games. The only ones I've seen are the drip feed of PS Plus premium titles. Maybe Konami will release the first 2 games through that. I'll take anything at this point, but ultimately the preference is to have 5 games in one package. A collection I do think is fairly likely. A new game though, I don't think is happening for a very long time. Fighting Vipers was meant to appeal to Western audiences since they weren't as taken with Virtua Fighter as Japan was. That being said, Fighting Vipers made even less of a splash than Virtua Fighter in the West and was again more successful in Japan, certainly due to the Saturn massively underperforming in the States too. When the sequel was released for the Dreamcast, Sega skipped the US release altogether. It came out only in Europe and Japan, so I'm sure that affected sales for this already niche game. The only Fighting Viper thing to happen after this was both games being playable in the Yakuza series. Even when Virtua Fighter returns and it does really well, I think the best we can hope for is a guest appearance from a Fighting Viper. I don't think the series will ever return beyond being put in a Yakuza or Sega arcade collection. But that's more than Battle Arena Toshinden is ever gonna get, so I'm saying it's extremely unlikely for a return. Here's a big one, Darkstalkers. We were so close to a comeback for this series with Ono doing the whole Darkstalkers aren't dead campaign during the Street Fighter Cross Tekken release. There was even a trailer for it, but it was never posted officially online. I think the 1-2 combo of the poor sales of the Darkstalkers Resurrection HD and Street Fighter Cross Tekken's reception was what killed the project. Once Capcom found out fighting games could lose money again, they didn't want to take a risk on the IP. How did Darkstalkers die in the first place? Well, perhaps it was the declining sales of 2D fighters as a whole. The series sold decently enough to keep it going and released outside Japan, but during the era of 3D fighters, I think people stopped paying attention to it as much. Despite this, I think a new Darkstalkers could work in a more modern sense. With the way things are with Street Fighter 6, I'm confident they could pull it off and do the series justice. You wouldn't know Darkstalkers is dead either with all the Morgan merch and re-releases. That's what confuses me the most. They're willing to sell statues or clothes, and I'm assuming that makes money because they keep doing it. Maybe by this point, Capcom understands it's proven people are willing to spend money on a new game. I know that's a much more expensive endeavor, but I think people will actually put their money where their mouth is on this one. I love Rival Schools even more, but I'm not as confident with that series being able to make a profit like a new Darkstalkers would. I think the folks at Capcom's fighting game division genuinely love these games, and that's what makes me confident a new Darkstalkers will actually happen. I can't imagine Street Fighter 6 being the sole Capcom fighter for a whole generation. Maybe it's my bias, but I'd put this in extremely likely territory. Speaking of Capcom, what about the rest of their fighting games? If you had asked me a couple months ago if there could be a new Marvel vs. Capcom or Capcom vs. SNK, I'd laugh in your face. But with the Marvel vs. collection and Terry and Street Fighter, I'm starting to hope again. Marvel vs. Capcom is inevitable. Even if this collection somehow bombs, the series has proven to be financially successful time and time again. Yes, even Marvel Infinite. This one I believe will happen this console generation. It's really just a matter of when at this point. Capcom vs. SNK might be a long while, hence these guest appearances from Terry and Mai in Street Fighter 6. I think that's the compromise to a full-on game, since Capcom may have their hands full with other projects. If a new Marvel vs. game is happening, do you think they have the team in time to make another crossover? No, SNK themselves will likely make the crossover, making this SNK vs. Capcom. They seem to be cranking out the AA fighters since Samurai Shodown came back. Perhaps after the new Fatal Fury game drops, they'll greenlight a vs. Capcom game. Hopefully when they do, we don't get confused if it's a shirt or something.
Is this for a t-shirt or some shit?
Now, the rest of the Capcom fighters I'm far less hopeful. There is only so many fighting game revivals to go around before Capcom oversaturates themselves, and I think they know that. Let's think about what's gonna get priority at Capcom. If we take Rival Schools, do you think that would get priority over a crossover title, or even Darkstalkers? The latter is niche too, but they put those characters in other games and sell merch of them far more than they do for Rival Schools. Power Stone is pretty much in the same camp. I know there were rumors of a potential remake, but that has yet to be proven true, which is a shame because I do think a game like that would work in this day and age. They don't need to go ham with the budget or anything either. These game series I'll have to put in extremely unlikely. Could happen, but I might be 40 by then. What about Red Earth, Cyberbots, Plasma Sword, Pocket Fighter, Tech Romancer, or I don't know, Gotcha Force? All of these games are deader than dead. They appear in collections and are referenced in other Capcom properties, but no one's really clamoring for these fighters like the Capcom vs. series, Darkstalkers, and even Power Stone. Pocket Fighter is a personal tragedy for me because I do think there is a place for a cute, simpler fighter. Unfortunately, those are much less frequent now, even in the indie game scene. Someone Capcom could really learn from in regards to how to revive dormant IPs is SNK. Their approach with revivals is to put out lower budget AA-esque titles. Samurai Shodown, KOF 15, and Fatal Fury are great high-quality games, but we all know their budgets aren't on the same level as Street Fighter or Tekken. To me, that's perfect, and that's what's allowed them to make games a bit quicker than their competition. Last Blade and Art of Fighting I do think will come back sooner than we might realize. I wish Capcom did this. Maybe that would shut some fans up about certain titles they claim they'll buy. I say go even cheaper than how SNK does it with games like Cyberbots and Plasma Sword. SNK truly is the best at their own preservation and keeping their IPs alive, which is something I wish everyone else did as well. Except their Neo Geo 64 titles. Bariki 1 is staying dead. Def Jam, I'll say off the bat, is never coming back, be it a remaster or a sequel. EA probably doesn't want to shell out the cash to pay for likenesses and music for a remaster. Some of these artists aren't even affiliated with Def Jam, the record label either, so there's gonna be legal hurdles there. Even if a new game came out, would it be any good? Def Jam Icon killed the franchise since fans seemed taken aback by it, and from what I've researched, it didn't seem to sell all too well. You guys remember the time the Def Jam official Twitter said if they got 1 million follows, they would have a special announcement, heavily implying it was the return of the fighter, and then turned out it was nothing? Yeah, guess they were just trying to farm some followers. Final Fantasy Dissidia. Oh boy. I love this series so much, even Dissidia NT. But damn were they doing everything to kill any scene this game could have had. First off, it was a PS4 exclusive and didn't even have a PC release. Second, there was no local multiplayer of any kind, not even through LAN. Any potential of this game developing a community was fucked day one. No shock Dissidia NT bombed hard, but that was only scratching the surface. Square tried to salvage something by releasing a free version, and I'm sure that boosted the player base a little bit, but that was definitely short-lived. Tetsuya Nomura himself did say he thinks they should do a remaster of 012 or NT, but just because someone as high up as him wants it doesn't mean it's gonna happen. I think NT killed the franchise, and even hopes for a re-release seem incredibly slim. Love to be wrong, but I'm thinking this is extremely unlikely. If the series maybe returns, it's time to do a full-on reboot. The concept of a Final Fantasy crossover is just too good of an idea to leave alone. Blazeblu is an interesting case because all the games have sold well, it's been highly praised by fans, and the IP isn't in some sort of legal limbo. So why hasn't a new one come out since Blazeblu Tag? Similar to Soul Calibur, the creator and producer of the series, Mori Toshimichi, left Arc System Works. With no one to vouch for the series and lead a new project, the team's priorities have shifted to other games. Spin-offs of Blazeblu titles are still coming out, but they're made by completely different teams and aren't fighters. With that, the fighting game series is on ice. I do think a new game will be released down the line, but not anytime soon. Guilty Gear is probably what Arc Systems is happy to stick with for the time being. And then on a game that is especially tragic for me, Dead or Alive. The fighting game for a while was killing it with sales even when 3 of those games were Xbox exclusives. DOA 5 costume DLC sold well enough for Tecmo to greenlight additional DLC characters and even DOA 6. Speaking of which, this entry was a smoke and gun of how the series was killed. This game massively underperformed, and releasing a free-to-play version didn't move the needle much. It was missing a lot of what DOA 5 had, with characters being cut just to be resold as DLC, and barely different from how they were in 5, which miffed a lot of fans. Not only that, but the whole hair dye DLC controversy. It felt like this game was nickel and diming you at any chance they got. If we pretend that the DLC didn't exist, the game itself was certainly underwhelming as well from what people expect from a DOA game. The stages were not impressive, the roster was much smaller than 5's default one, and the single-player offerings were not all that much fun. Chances for a comeback are pretty small since Team Ninja's priorities are with non-fighting game titles, and obviously games like Nioh make more money than DOA, so you can't exactly blame them. Allegedly, DOA 7 was being worked on by a small group within Team Ninja and was cancelled, but there's conflicting information on this. True or not, nothing is coming out of DOA for a while. I think Team Ninja truly does want to make another entry, but perhaps higher-ups at Tecmo aren't making that the priority. This IP does have value, but let's not hope a new Extreme Beach Volleyball game gets announced first. If that happens, that's a bad sign for the DOA series returning. Hopefully Tecmo doesn't think the costume DLC doing well is the only reason to greenlight a sequel, because if so, they might just make another lame-ass volleyball game instead. I really want the fighting game genre to succeed, but I also don't want a world where it's just the big 4 franchises being Street Fighter, Tekken, Mortal Kombat, and Smash. I love these games to death, but maybe the genre can spread its wings a little. Series once considered niche like Guilty Gear have been successful, I don't see why a Darkstalkers couldn't. SNK has proven you don't need a big-ass budget to make great fighters. Maybe make a reboot of Clayfighter as a smaller digital title. How much could Clay cost? I'll buy him some Clay. With how long and how much games cost to make, companies can take a smaller risk on smaller titles, but they seem adverse to that. I'd love for all these games to make a comeback to an extent, but being realistic, we know some of these are gonna stay worm food.